Drive through Gary today, and you will see streets built for crowds that no longer exist. Wide boulevards stretch past empty lots where homes once stood. Storefronts with shattered windows line what was once a vibrant downtown. The sidewalks, cracked and overgrown, were designed for a population of 200,000. Fewer than 70,000 people live here now. The silence feels unnatural, as if the city is holding its breath, waiting for something that will never return. Gary didn't decline because it made the wrong choices. It declined because it was designed to have no choices at all. In 1906, United States Steel Corporation built an entire city from scratch in less than a year. They chose the location, drew the streets, constructed the buildings, and decided who would live where. Every decision served a single purpose: feeding the largest steel mill complex in the world. The city had no independent economy, no diversified industry, no reason to exist beyond the corporation that created it. They called it the Magic City. Newspapers marveled at how quickly it rose from empty sand dunes. Within a generation, Gary became one of the fastest-growing cities in America, a symbol of industrial might and modern planning. Then the corporation no longer needed so many workers. The magic vanished. The city remained. What happens when corporate permanence is mistaken for civic destiny? Gary holds the answer. It stands as one of the purest examples of a company town pushed to its logical extreme. A place born all at once, abandoned slowly, and left behind with schools, streets, and buildings sized for a population that would never return. Chapter 1. The Birth of an Instant City. In 1905, the southern shore of Lake Michigan stretched wild and undeveloped through northwest Indiana. Sand dunes rose and fell along the coastline. Marshland spread inland, broken only by scattered farms and small settlements. The area had remained largely untouched because it seemed unsuitable for much of anything. The soil was poor, the landscape was difficult. But to the right eyes, this empty stretch of lakefront held extraordinary value. United States Steel Corporation faced a problem that required a dramatic solution. Formed just 4 years earlier through a merger orchestrated by J.P. Morgan, the company had become the world's first billion-dollar corporation. Demand for steel was climbing faster than existing mills could handle. Railroads needed rails, cities needed beams for skyscrapers, factories needed machinery. The corporation needed to expand production capacity by an unprecedented amount, and quickly. Traditional expansion wouldn't work. Adding to existing facilities in Pittsburgh or Chicago meant navigating crowded urban landscapes, dealing with high land costs, and working around established communities. The leadership wanted something different. They wanted total control from the beginning. Elbert Henry Gary provided that vision. A lawyer by training, Gary had risen to become chairman of the board of U.S. Steel. Unlike the rough industrialists who had built the steel industry through sweat and fire, Gary was refined, calculated, and methodical. He wore fine suits and spoke in measured tones. He believed in organization, efficiency, and corporate paternalism. When he looked at that empty Indiana shoreline, he saw perfection. Direct access to Lake Michigan for shipping, proximity to Chicago's rail networks, and most importantly, blank space where a company could build exactly what it needed without compromise. The plan was audacious. U.S. Steel would construct the largest integrated steel mill complex ever built and surround it with a complete city designed specifically to house and serve the workforce. Everything would be new. Everything would be planned. Everything would serve the mill. In early 1906, thousands of workers arrived. They came by train and wagon, carrying tools and ambition. The company had purchased over 9,000 acres of lakefront property. Surveyors marked streets in a grid pattern stretching south from the lake. Construction crews began simultaneously on dozens of fronts. While some teams excavated foundations for massive blast furnaces, others laid rail lines to connect the site to existing networks. Housing blocks rose in coordinated waves. The sound of hammers, saws, and steam engines filled air that had known only wind and water. The speed of transformation was staggering. In older cities, growth happened organically over generations. Buildings appeared one at a time as residents arrived and businesses formed. Gary emerged all at once, as if someone had drawn a complete city on paper and then willed it into existence in months rather than decades. By summer, the first blast furnace was taking shape. By fall, the first streets were paved. By winter, the first families were moving into company-built homes. U.S. Steel marketed Gary as a model city for the modern age. The boulevard system was laid out wide and straight, inspired by progressive urban planning movements. Parks were designated throughout the residential areas. The company installed electric streetlights, underground sewers, and running water from the start. These were luxuries that many American cities had added piecemeal over years. Gary would have them from day one. The message was clear. This was not a rough frontier town or a chaotic industrial slum. This was the future. Workers flooded in from across America and around the world. Polish immigrants arrived seeking wages higher than anything available in Europe. African Americans came north from the south, drawn by promises of industrial jobs. Greeks, Mexicans, Croatians, Italians, and Russians joined the migration. Within months, Gary became one of the most ethnically diverse communities in the Midwest. People who spoke different languages and practiced different religions found themselves living side by side in a city that hadn't existed a year before. The corporation controlled everything. U.S. Steel owned the land beneath every building. Company architects had designed the street layout. Company planners decided which neighborhoods would be residential and which commercial. The company built the homes and rented them to workers. Company stores sold goods. Even the churches, though independently run, stood on land the corporation provided. This wasn't hidden or controversial at the time. It was the explicit arrangement. Gary existed to serve the mill, and the mill belonged to U.S. Steel. On July 12, 1906, Gary was officially incorporated as a city. The population already numbered in the thousands and was growing by the day. The mills were producing steel. The downtown was taking shape with brick commercial buildings lining Broadway, the main thoroughfare. Hotels opened to house the continuing influx of workers and businessmen. Saloons appeared despite company disapproval. Restaurants served food from dozens of countries. The instant city was alive. What had been empty dunes and marshland now held a functioning industrial metropolis. The transformation had taken less than a year. Gary's founders celebrated the achievement as proof of American ingenuity and corporate efficiency. They had created something from nothing at a scale and speed the world had never seen. Chapter 2: The Magic City Rises. The Magic City had arrived, and it seemed destined for greatness. Gary exploded. Between 1906 and 1920, the population surged from 0 to over 55,000, making it one of the fastest-growing cities in American history. New arrivals stepped off trains daily, carrying suitcases and hopes for steady work. The mills operated around the clock. Construction never stopped. Entire neighborhoods appeared in months. Streets that had been mud paths in spring were lined with homes by fall. The city grew so rapidly that maps went out of date before they could be printed. World War I turned the boom into a frenzy. European steel production collapsed as nations mobilized for war. American mills became the arsenal of democracy, and Gary stood at the center. Demand for steel skyrocketed. U.S. Steel expanded the mill complex, adding furnaces and rolling mills. The workforce doubled. Men worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Overtime was mandatory. The pay was good by the standards of the time, and for many immigrant families, it represented wealth beyond anything their parents had known in the old country. The neighborhoods reflected the diversity of the workforce. The South Side became home to Polish and Croatian families. Churches with onion domes and Slavic inscriptions rose among the houses. Women in headscarves walked to market. The smell of pierogi and cabbage drifted from kitchens. Greek immigrants settled near the mills, opening restaurants and coffee houses where men gathered after shifts to talk and smoke. The West Side drew Mexican. Families who had come north during the Revolution, seeking stability and wages. They built their own churches and maintained their own traditions, creating small pieces of home in an industrial city far from the border. African American families arrived as part of the Great Migration, fleeing the violence and limited opportunities of the Jim Crow South. They settled primarily in Midtown, where segregation kept them separated from white neighborhoods. The boundaries were unspoken but understood. Black workers did the same dangerous jobs in the mills as their white counterparts, but came home to different streets and different schools. Still, Gary offered something the South did not: industrial wages and the possibility of building a future without constant fear. Broadway became the heart of it all. The wide boulevard ran through downtown, lined with brick and stone buildings that grew taller each year. Department stores displayed the latest fashions in plate glass windows. The Palace and the Tivoli theaters showed films and hosted vaudeville acts. Restaurants ranged from simple lunch counters to formal dining rooms. On Saturday nights, the sidewalks filled with families dressed in their best clothes, strolling past shop windows and greeting neighbors. Electric signs blazed against the darkness. Streetcars clanged down the center of the street. The energy felt urban and sophisticated, nothing like the sand dunes that had occupied the space just years before. The mills dominated everything. They stretched for miles along the lakefront, a landscape of fire and metal. Blast furnaces rose like cathedrals of industry, their stacks pouring smoke into the sky day and night. At night, the glow from the furnaces turned the clouds orange. The light was visible for miles, a beacon that announced Gary's presence. The sound was constant, the roar of furnaces, the crash of steel being poured, the screech of machinery, the whistle of trains moving materials through the complex. The smell of sulfur and burning coal hung in the air, so thick you could taste it. Workers grew accustomed to the grit that settled on everything, the fine metallic dust that no amount of washing could completely remove. U.S. Steel's influence extended into every aspect of life. The company owned most of the housing and rented it to workers at rates that seemed reasonable but were carefully calculated to keep families dependent on steady employment. Company stores offered goods on credit, creating another tie. The unspoken understanding was clear. Your job, your home, your ability to feed your family, all depended on staying in the corporation's good graces. There were no unions. Speaking of organizing meant risking everything. That control shattered in 1919. Across the nation, 365,000 steelworkers walked off the job, demanding an 8-hour workday, better pay, and the right to organize. Gary became a flashpoint. When workers struck, U.S. Steel brought in strikebreakers, many of them black workers from the South, who had been promised jobs without being told they would be crossing picket lines. Tensions exploded. Violence erupted in the streets. Governor James Goodrich declared martial law and sent the National Guard to occupy the city. Soldiers with rifles patrolled Broadway. Machine gun nests were positioned at intersections. For weeks, Gary felt like a war zone. The strike eventually collapsed. Workers returned defeated, and the company's control was reinforced. But the illusion of benevolent paternalism had cracked. People understood the arrangement more clearly now. Yet, prosperity continued through the 1920s. The paradox was obvious to anyone who looked closely, but easy to ignore when paychecks arrived regularly. Gary's wealth was entirely built on dependence. The city had no major employers beyond U.S. Steel and the businesses that served mill workers. There was no diversified economy, no backup plan. But in the moment, such concerns seemed distant and theoretical. The mills were running at capacity. New homes were being built. Schools were opening to handle the children of the growing population. Why worry about hypothetical futures when the present was so abundant? Cultural life flourished within this framework. Churches became centers of ethnic communities, places where language and traditions from the old country could be preserved. Polish families attended Mass in Polish. Greek Orthodox churches maintained ancient liturgies. African American congregations filled sanctuaries with gospel music and provided support networks in a segregated city. Social clubs formed around nationality, providing insurance, organizing festivals, and maintaining connections to homelands most members would never see again. These institutions gave Gary depth and character beyond its industrial function. They created the feeling of permanence, the sense that this was not just a company town, but a real community with roots. By 1930, Gary's population reached 100,000. The city had grown from nothing to become the 5th largest in Indiana in just 24 years. New municipal buildings rose downtown. City Methodist Church opened in 1926, a massive Gothic structure with room for 3,000 worshipers, built to serve a population that would keep growing forever. Parks were expanded, high schools were built. Everything pointed toward a future of continued expansion. Gary seemed unstoppable. The mills produced more steel than any other complex in the world. The city was modern, diverse, and dynamic. It had weathered the strike and the brief recession that followed World War I. The assumption, spoken and unspoken, was that steel demand would continue rising indefinitely, and that Gary's purpose was therefore permanent. The Magic City appeared to have become something real and lasting, something that could stand on its own. That confidence would prove to be the most dangerous illusion of all. Chapter 3: The People Who Defined Gary. The Great Migration brought thousands of black families north to Gary between the 1940s and 1960s. They came from Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and Tennessee, fleeing sharecropping, segregation, and the constant threat of violence. Gary offered something different: industrial jobs that paid real wages, the possibility of owning property, and the chance to raise children with futures beyond the cotton fields. Letters home spoke of steady paychecks, brick, houses, and schools where black children could learn without hand-me-down textbooks. The promise was powerful enough to convince entire families to pack everything they owned and board northbound trains. They found opportunity, but also familiar boundaries. Housing segregation confined most black families to Midtown, a neighborhood south of downtown where the streets were narrower and the houses older. Landlords in white neighborhoods simply refused to rent or sell to black families. Banks denied mortgages. The pattern was unofficial, but absolute. Midtown became a city within a city, a place where black-owned businesses served black customers, where churches anchored community life, and where families built networks of mutual support in a town that offered wages but not welcome. Yet Gary made history in 1945 when it became the first major city in the Midwest to fully integrate its public schools. The decision came after sustained pressure from the black community and reflected the city's relative youth. Unlike older cities with decades of entrenched segregation, Gary's institutions were still forming. The integration was not smooth or complete, but it happened. Black and white. Children attended the same schools, sat in the same classrooms, and learned from the same teachers. For black families who had grown up under Jim Crow, even imperfect integration represented profound change. Daily life in Gary's working-class neighborhoods followed the rhythm of the mills. Men left for shifts before dawn, lunch pails in hand. Women managed households, often working second shifts themselves in laundries, restaurants, or as domestic help in wealthier homes. Children played in the streets, their games punctuated by the distant whistle of the mills marking shift changes. Corner stores extended credit to families between paychecks. Churches held services on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings, anchoring the week. The air always carried the metallic smell of the mills, a constant reminder of what sustained everything. At 2300 Jackson Street stood a small house that would become the most famous address in Gary's history. The house was modest even by Midtown standards: 2 bedrooms, cramped rooms, a small yard. Joseph and Catherine Jackson moved there with their growing family in the 1950s. They would eventually raise 10 children in that space, a fact that required careful organization and constant sacrifice. Beds were shared, privacy was impossible, every inch of space served a purpose. Joe Jackson worked as a crane operator at the steel mill, earning enough to keep the family fed and housed, but never enough to escape the calculations of working-class life. He had once dreamed of musical success himself, playing guitar in a local rhythm and blues band called the Falcons. That dream had faded under the weight of family responsibilities, but it never disappeared entirely. He saw music as a path his children might follow, out of Gary, away from the mills, away from the limitations he had accepted. He purchased instruments and pushed his sons to practice. The living room became a rehearsal space. Neighbors heard music pouring from the small house at all hours. Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and eventually Michael formed a group under their father's demanding direction. They played local talent shows and clubs, honing their performance in the same venues where Gary's black community gathered for entertainment. The local music scene was vibrant, shaped by the Motown sound coming from Detroit and the blues traditions families had carried north from the Mississippi Delta. On August 29, 1958, Catherine gave birth to their 8th child, Michael Joseph Jackson. He grew up in the shadow of the steel mills, their orange glow visible from the windows of the Jackson Street house. The sound of the mills provided a constant industrial soundtrack to childhood. Like every kid in Midtown, young Michael understood that Gary meant work, that adults disappeared into the mills and came home tired, that success meant escaping to something different. The Jackson 5 became Gary's proudest export. By the late 1960s, they were performing across the region, their talent undeniable. When they signed with Motown Records in 1968 and their first singles topped the charts, Gary celebrated. Here was proof that something extraordinary could emerge from the industrial city, that talent and determination could overcome the limitations of place. Local newspapers covered their success. The community claimed them as proof of Gary's vitality. The irony was impossible to miss. The city's most famous sons left as soon as they could. Success meant departure. The Jackson family moved to California in 1969, trading the two-bedroom house on Jackson Street for mansions in Los Angeles. Michael Jackson would become the most famous entertainer in the world, but Gary would always be mentioned in his biography as the humble beginning, the place he came from and left behind. The house at 2300 Jackson Street remained, eventually becoming a pilgrimage site for fans from around the world who wanted to see where it all began. Gary's population reached its peak in 1960 at over 178,000 residents. The city had never been larger or more alive. The mills employed tens of thousands. Downtown was thriving. Neighborhoods were full. Schools were crowded. Everything seemed solid and permanent. The Jackson 5's success felt like an affirmation, proof that Gary could produce excellence. But the high water mark had arrived. The city had reached the limit of what a single industry could sustain. The decline would not be sudden, but it was already beginning. The first cracks were forming in the foundation, invisible to most, but undeniable in retrospect. Gary stood at the peak, unaware that the only direction left was down. Chapter 4: The Beginning of the End. The shift began quietly in the early 1960s, with changes most residents didn't immediately notice. U.S. Steel installed new equipment in the mills: automated rolling systems, computer-controlled furnaces, mechanized material handling. The company called it modernization, and in purely technical terms, it was. The mills could produce more steel with fewer workers. Tasks that once required dozens of men now needed a handful and a machine. Efficiency increased, employment dropped, foreign competition accelerated the transformation. Japanese and European steel mills, rebuilt with modern equipment after World War II, began flooding American markets with cheaper steel. They had newer facilities, lower labor costs, and aggressive pricing strategies. U.S. Steel faced a choice: modernize to compete or lose market share entirely. The corporation chose modernization, which meant automation, which meant eliminating jobs. The first wave of layoffs hit in the mid-1960s. Thousands of workers received notices. Men who had spent decades in the mills, who had raised families on steel wages, suddenly found themselves obsolete. The company offered no alternative employment, no retraining programs, no transition assistance. The equation was simple. The corporation no longer needed as many workers, so workers were let go. For families whose entire existence depended on mill employment, the layoffs were catastrophic. People began leaving. Some followed jobs to other cities. Others moved to suburbs where housing was newer and cheaper. The exodus started slowly, but gained momentum. Homes went on the market and sold for less than their owners had paid. Then they sold for even less. Then they stopped selling at all. Streets that had been fully occupied began showing vacant houses. The population that had peaked above 178,000 in 1960 started its long decline. White flight accelerated the process. Middle-class white. Families, particularly those who could afford to leave, moved to surrounding suburbs like Merrillville and Hobart. The pattern was familiar across American cities in the 1960s, driven by racial tension, changing neighborhoods, and the draw of suburban life. But in Gary, white flight had particular consequences because the city's tax base was already contracting from job losses. When the families with the most resources left, they took their property tax payments with them. City revenue fell precisely when the need for services was growing. The mathematics of decline became brutal. Gary's infrastructure had been built for a population of 200,000 or more. The water system, sewer lines, street maintenance, schools, and public services were all sized for a city that size. As the population fell toward 150,000, then below it, the same infrastructure had to be maintained by a shrinking number of taxpayers. Services deteriorated. Streets developed potholes that went unrepaired. Parks grew overgrown. School buildings designed for thousands served hundreds. their empty classrooms a constant reminder of what had been lost. In 1967, Richard Hatcher was elected mayor, becoming one of the first black mayors of a major American city. His victory was historic and hard-fought, won against fierce opposition and the political machine that had controlled Gary for decades. He took office with hope and ambitious plans for renewal. What he inherited was a city in crisis. Hatcher faced an impossible position. Gary had been designed to serve a beer corporation, not to function as an independent city. There was no diversified economy to fall back on, no alternative employment base, no independent tax revenue beyond what the mills and mill workers generated. When U.S. Steel reduced its workforce, the entire foundation of Gary's economy crumbled. Hatcher could not create jobs. He could not force the corporation to hire. He could not stop families from leaving or convince businesses to stay. He could only manage the decline as best he could with constantly shrinking resources. He fought for federal aid and tried to attract new industry. Some businesses came, but nothing on the scale needed to replace what was being lost. The mills still operated, their furnaces still glowed at night, trains still moved through the complex, but employment had dropped by half from its peak. The remaining workers kept steel production going, but they could not support an entire city. The gap between what Gary needed and what it could afford grew wider each year. Schools felt the impact directly. Buildings constructed during the boom years to handle thousands of students now sat half empty. The district had to heat, maintain, and staff facilities designed for a population that no longer existed. Teachers faced larger class sizes as positions were eliminated. Programs were cut. Sports teams folded. The deterioration was visible in cracked plaster, outdated textbooks, and gymnasiums where paint peeled from the walls. Downtown Broadway, once vibrant with shoppers and moviegoers, began showing gaps. A store would close, then another. Windows were boarded up. The department stores that had once defined Gary's commercial heart struggled as customers moved to suburban malls. The Palace Theater, which had hosted generations of families, saw declining attendance. The street that had symbolized Gary's arrival as a real city now reflected its decline. The mills kept running through all of this, a constant presence on the lakefront. But they no longer defined the city's future the way they had defined its past. They were simply there, employing enough people to keep operating, but not enough to sustain Gary. The corporation had moved on from its vision of a model city. What happened to Gary now was the city's problem, not U.S. Steel's. By 1970, the population had dropped below 150,000. The decline showed no signs of stopping. Everyone could see what was happening, but no one had a solution. Gary was losing the only purpose it had ever been given, and there was no replacement in sight. The city continued to exist, continued to function, but the trajectory was unmistakable. What had risen so quickly was falling almost as fast, and the people who remained watched it happen with a sense of powerlessness that came from understanding the fundamental truth. Gary had never been built to survive on its own. Chapter 5: The Fall. The 1980s brought devastation to America's industrial heartland. The Rust Belt collapsed under the weight of foreign competition, automation, and corporate disinvestment. Cities that had built their entire identities around manufacturing watched their economies disintegrate. Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cleveland, Youngstown, all suffered, but few fell as far or as fast as Gary. U.S. Steel announced massive layoffs throughout the decade. Entire departments were eliminated, shifts were cut. Mills that had run continuously for decades went cold. The numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands of jobs disappeared from Gary in less than a generation. Workers who had believed their positions were permanent, who had raised children and bought homes on the assumption of lifetime employment, found themselves in unemployment lines with no prospects and skills that no longer had value in the changing economy. The cascade effect was immediate and merciless. When mill workers lost their jobs, they stopped spending money at local businesses. Restaurants closed because customers stopped coming. Clothing stores shut down because no one was buying. Car dealerships went dark. The businesses that had grown up to serve the mill workers had no other customer base to fall back on. Gary's economy was not diverse. It was singular. When the steel jobs vanished, everything else collapsed in sequence like dominoes. Broadway became a corridor of failure. The grand commercial street that had once symbolized Gary's prosperity transformed into a monument to abandonment. Storefronts that had displayed the latest fashions now showed only empty shelves behind dirty windows. For sale signs appeared, then faded in the sun for years without attracting buyers. Glass shattered and was never replaced. Metal security gates pulled down and rusted in place. The Palace Theater, which had entertained generations, closed in 1972. The building stood empty, its marquee blank, its ornate interior slowly deteriorating. Block after block, the same pattern repeated. Closed businesses, boarded windows, decay advancing like a slow flood. The human cost was immeasurable. Families that stayed in Gary found themselves trapped in a death spiral. Property values collapsed. Homes purchased for $30,000 or $40,000 in the 1960s were worth $10,000 by the 1980s, then $5,000, then nothing. Homeowners owed more on their mortgages then. Their houses could ever sell for. They couldn't leave even if they wanted to, because selling meant accepting devastating financial losses. So they stayed, watching their neighborhoods empty around them, watching their investments evaporate, watching the city die. Schools struggled with impossible mathematics. Gary's school system had been built to educate tens of thousands of children in modern facilities spread across the city. By the 1980s, enrollment had dropped by more than half, but the buildings remained. The district was forced to maintain enormous structures with crumbling infrastructure on a budget that shrank every year as property tax revenue collapsed. Roofs leaked. Heating systems failed. Textbooks were decades out of date. Teachers took pay cuts or lost their jobs entirely. Programs that had once distinguished Gary's schools, music, arts, athletics, were eliminated one by one. Students attended classes in buildings where entire wings sat unused, where echoing hallways led to locked doors and dark classrooms that would never open again. Crime rose as opportunities vanished. When legitimate employment disappears and poverty deepens, desperation follows. Gary's crime rate climbed through the 1980s and 1990s. The city became known for violence, drug trafficking, and gang activity. Police struggled to maintain order with reduced budgets and shrinking manpower. Neighborhoods that had once been safe became dangerous. Parents who had walked freely at night now locked their doors and warned their children to stay inside after dark. The social fabric that had held the community together frayed under the pressure of economic collapse. The speed of transformation was shocking. Within a single generation, Gary went from industrial powerhouse to national symbol of urban decay. People who had grown up in the prosperous 1950s watched their city become unrecognizable by the 1990s. The change happened faster than in older cities because Gary had less foundation beneath it. Detroit and Cleveland had existed before the automobile and steel industries. They had downtown districts that predated the industrial age, historic buildings that held cultural value beyond economics. Gary had been born as a company town and had nothing that predated U.S. Steel. When the corporation reduced its presence, there was nothing underneath to support the city. U.S. Steel continued operating through the collapse, but as a shell of its former self. The company still produced steel at the Gary Works complex, and still does today. But employment had dropped from over 30,000 at the peak to fewer than 5,000 by the 2000s. The mills that once ran 24 hours a day with 3 full shifts now operated intermittently. Sections of the complex sat idle, vast industrial spaces filled with obsolete equipment and silence. The corporation had wrung maximum efficiency from minimal workforce, achieving its goal of remaining profitable while shedding the burden of employing the city it had created. The population collapse continued without pause. Gary dropped below 100,000 residents by 2000, falling through thresholds that had once seemed impossible. The city that had held 178,000 people just 40 years earlier was disappearing. By 2010, the population was under 80,000. By 2020, it had fallen to approximately 70,000. The decline showed no sign of stopping. The cruel mathematics of infrastructure became unbearable. Gary's water mains, sewer systems, electrical grid, and street network had been designed for 200,000 people or more. Maintaining that infrastructure with 70,000 residents was economically impossible. The city couldn't afford to repair water mains that served empty blocks. Streets buckled and cracked because there was no money to repave them. Streetlights went dark and stayed dark. The gap between what needed to be done and what could be afforded grew wider every year. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned, not just scattered houses, but entire blocks, entire subdivisions. Homes that families had occupied for decades sat empty, their windows broken, their doors hanging open, nature slowly reclaiming what humans had built. Grass grew waist-high in yards, trees sprouted through foundations, vines crawled up walls and pulled at roofs. Walking through these areas felt post-apocalyptic, as if some catastrophe had driven everyone away overnight, leaving possessions scattered and buildings to rot. City Methodist Church, that massive Gothic structure built in 1926 to serve a growing population, closed in 1975. The building stood abandoned for decades, its roof eventually collapsing, its interior open to the sky. Nature invaded through broken windows. The sanctuary that had once held thousands of worshipers became a ruin, one of the most photographed symbols of Gary's fall. Urban explorers and photographers made pilgrimages to document its decay, turning the church into an emblem of industrial collapse. Gary became infamous. The city's name appeared in articles about urban decay, in discussions of failed cities, in political debates about the Rust Belt's future. Late-night comedians used Gary as a punchline. The city that had once been celebrated as a marvel of modern planning was now shorthand for failure. National media coverage inevitably showed the same images: abandoned buildings, empty streets, the ruins of City Methodist Church. Gary had become a symbol, but not the kind it had been in 1906. Today, the population hovers around 70,000 and continues to fall. The city that U.S. Steel built for perpetual growth has settled into permanent decline. Drive through Gary now, and the scale of the loss becomes visceral. You pass block after block of empty lots where homes once stood. You see commercial districts with more closed businesses than open ones. You pass schools built for thousands that serve hundreds. The infrastructure, the wide boulevards, the extensive grid of streets remains as evidence of what was planned, but will never be filled again. Gary exists, but as a fraction of what it was designed to be, a city built for a future that never came and a population that left and will not return. Chapter 6: Gary and the Illusion of Permanence. Drive through Gary today, and the city reveals itself in layers of absence. The wide boulevards stretch past empty lots where homes once stood, their foundations barely visible beneath overgrown grass. Broadway's storefronts sit dark, their windows either boarded or shattered. The silence feels unnatural for streets designed to carry crowds. You can travel blocks without seeing another car, entire neighborhoods without encountering another person. What remains stands as monument and warning. City Methodist Church rises above the surrounding decay, its Gothic towers still proud, despite the collapsed roof, and vegetation growing through the sanctuary. It has become Gary's most photographed ruin, an accidental cathedral to industrial collapse. The Jackson family home at 2300 Jackson Street still stands, maintained as a pilgrimage site for fans who come to see where Michael Jackson spent his childhood in the shadow of the mills. U.S. Steel still operates a portion of the Gary Works complex, employing a few thousand workers, producing steel for a fraction of the workforce that once filled these same buildings. Gary's lesson offers extreme clarity about the nature of company towns. The city had no economic diversification, no political independence, no choice about its own future. Everything was designed to serve a single corporation's needs. When those needs changed, the city had nothing to fall back on. The mistake was fundamental, assuming that corporate permanence equals civic permanence. U.S. Steel proved permanent enough to survive. Gary did not. The city stands as a warning about what happens when a community is built around a single purpose. There have been attempted revivals over the decades, efforts to attract new industry or reimagine Gary's future. A few succeeded in small ways. A casino opened near the lakefront. Some light manufacturing moved in, but nothing on the scale needed to reverse the trajectory. You cannot rebuild a city of 200,000 when only 70,000 remain and the number keeps falling. Yet people do remain. Families who have lived in Gary for generations, who bought homes here and built lives here, continue. They maintain their houses, support local businesses, send their children to struggling schools, and insist on community despite everything. Their resilience deserves acknowledgement, even as the broader narrative bends toward decline. Gary's place in American memory has completed its transformation. The Magic City became a cautionary tale, a name synonymous with urban failure, a case study in what happens when corporate vision replaces civic foundation. The wide streets wait empty. The mills glow dimly on the lakefront, shadows of their former brilliance. The buildings stand sized for a population that will never return. Gary was built all at once, abandoned slowly, and stands now as proof that cities need more than steel to survive. They need diversified economies, independent institutions, and purposes beyond serving corporate profits. Without these, even the grandest plans and the fastest growth mean nothing. The Magic City dissolved because it was never built to last beyond its usefulness to the corporation that imagined it. The emptiness that remains is not mysterious. It is the logical conclusion of a city designed without a future of its own.